In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd named Şafak Yıldız was walking across a barren hillside in southeastern Turkey when his foot struck something hard beneath the soil. He dug. What he found wasn't a rock. It was a carved stone, smooth on one side, covered in reliefs of animals that no longer exist in that region. Foxes, boars, vultures with wings spread wide, frozen mid-flight in a limestone that had been shaped by human hands. He reported it to the nearest museum. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived shortly after, and what Schmidt uncovered over the next 2 decades quietly dismantled one of the most fundamental assumptions in the entire history of human civilization. The site was called Göbekli Tepe, and according to radiocarbon dating, the same method used by universities around the world, it was built approximately 12,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, the Egyptian pyramids are around 4,500 years old. Stonehenge, roughly 5,000. The oldest known writing system, about 5,500 years old. Göbekli Tepe predates all of them by thousands of years. Here's the part that doesn't fit the textbook. The people who built it, according to official archaeology, were hunter-gatherers, nomads, people who, by every definition science had accepted for over a century, should not have been capable of organized construction, symbolic art, or coordinated labor at any scale. And yet, there it was, carved, assembled, deliberate. The question isn't just how they built it, and the question is why the discovery took this long to reach you, and what it actually means for the story we've been told about where we come from. To understand why Göbekli Tepe is so disruptive, you need to understand what the official timeline looked like before Şafak Yıldız's foot hit that stone. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists operated on a model that felt logical, clean, and almost inevitable. Human civilization, they argued, followed a specific sequence. First came survival, hunting animals, gathering plants, moving constantly in search of food. Then, around 10,000 years ago, something shifted. People learned to farm. Farming created surplus. Surplus created settlements. Settlements grew into villages, then cities. Cities produced specialization. Priests, engineers, rulers, artists, and specialization finally produced monuments. In other words, agriculture first, civilization second. This model had a name, the Neolithic Revolution, and for decades it was treated less like a theory and more like a law of nature. The problem is that Göbekli Tepe doesn't fit inside it. The site sits on a limestone ridge in what is now the Şanlıurfa province of Turkey, about 15 kilometers northeast of the city center. The region today is dry, dusty, and largely empty. But 12,000 years ago, it sat at the edge of a fertile zone, a landscape of wild grasses, freshwater sources, and animal migrations that would have supported human life without the need for agriculture. What Schmidt and his team found wasn't a single structure. It was a complex, a series of circular enclosures, arranged across the hilltop in patterns that suggest deliberate planning. The enclosures are built around massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them over 5 meters tall, weighing between 10 and 20 tons. These are not rough stones stacked by accident. They are shaped, smoothed, and decorated with carvings of animals, snakes, scorpions, lions, vultures, ducks, rendered with a level of artistic skill that implies not just technical ability, but a symbolic vocabulary, a shared system of meaning. And here is where the official timeline begins to fracture. To quarry, transport, and erect pillars of that size requires organized labor. Not 2 people, not 10. Archaeologists estimate that coordinating the construction of even a single enclosure at Göbekli Tepe would have required hundreds of workers operating under some form of shared direction, a hierarchy, a plan, a reason to cooperate beyond simple survival. But according to the model that dominated archaeology for most of the 20th century, that level of social organization didn't exist yet. It wasn't supposed to arrive for another 5,000 to 6,000 years. Klaus Schmidt spent the rest of his life excavating that hillside. Before his death in 2014, he proposed something that many of his colleagues found deeply uncomfortable. Maybe the model was backwards. Maybe it wasn't agriculture that produced civilization. Maybe it was the other way around, that the desire to build something like Göbekli Tepe is what pushed people toward agriculture in the first place. A monument doesn't need a city to exist, but feeding the people who build one, that might be exactly what created the first farm. When Klaus Schmidt first presented his findings to the academic community, the reaction was not celebration. It was resistance. Not because the evidence was weak. The radiocarbon dating was conducted multiple times by multiple independent laboratories using multiple organic samples extracted from different layers of the site. The results were consistent. Göbekli Tepe was old, older than anything comparable ever found. And that consistency was precisely the problem. And if the site was real, and it was, then something significant had been erased from the accepted version of human history. Not accidentally, not through lack of evidence, but through a framework so deeply embedded in academic culture that contradicting it felt less like science and more like heresy. So let's look at what the stones are actually saying. Layer by layer. The pillars. The T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe are not random forms. Researchers now believe they represent stylized human figures. The top of the T corresponds to a head, the vertical shaft, a body, and carved into several of the pillars, almost hidden, easy to miss, are arms, hands, belts. These are not abstract shapes. They are beings, standing in a circle, facing inward. Toward what? No one knows. The carvings that cover them are not decorative in any casual sense. Here the animal figures appear in specific combinations, repeated across multiple enclosures, suggesting a consistent symbolic system. Vultures appear near headless human figures in at least 2 locations. Scorpions cluster near what some researchers interpret as celestial symbols. Foxes appear in positions that seem deliberate, almost ceremonial. Archaeoastronomers have proposed that several of the enclosures were aligned with specific star patterns visible 12,000 years ago. One study published in the Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry Journal suggested that enclosure D may have been oriented toward the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, at the precise latitude and date corresponding to the site's construction. If that alignment was intentional, it means the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not just skilled laborers. They were people who watched the sky with enough consistency and precision to encode what they saw into stone. The buried question. Here is the detail that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned. It was buried, deliberately, intentionally, by the people who built it. Around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, after being used for what appears to be 3,000 to 4,000 years, the entire complex was filled in. The enclosures were packed with rubble, flint tools, animal bones, and soil, in a process that archaeologists agree was organized and purposeful. Nothing about the burial pattern suggests collapse, invasion, or natural disaster. Someone made a decision to cover it. And because of that decision, the site was preserved almost perfectly beneath the surface, which is the only reason Schmidt found anything at all in 1994. The question of why it was buried has no agreed answer. But the fact that it was preserved by its own concealment raises an uncomfortable possibility that whoever built Göbekli Tepe understood, on some level, that what they were doing mattered enough to protect. What hasn't been excavated? This is perhaps the most significant detail of all. After 30 years of excavation, archaeologists estimate that only about 5% of the total site has been uncovered. 5%. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 2000s and 2010s have revealed that the hilltop contains at least 16 additional enclosures, still buried beneath the surface. So some of the buried structures appear, based on the radar data, to be significantly larger than anything excavated so far, which means that what has already challenged the entire framework of human prehistory represents a small fraction of what is actually there. Schmidt himself said, in one of his final interviews, that he believed Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated phenomenon, that it was, in his words, the beginning of something, not an anomaly at the edge of history, but evidence of a world that existed before the world we know. The mainstream response. It is worth being precise about what mainstream archaeology does and does not accept. The dating of Göbekli Tepe is not disputed. The sophistication of the construction is not disputed. The presence of symbolic art is not disputed. What remains contested is the interpretation. Some researchers argue that the social organization required to build the site could have emerged spontaneously among mobile groups, that hunter-gatherers were capable of temporary, large-scale cooperation without permanent hierarchy. Others argue that the astronomical alignments are coincidental, or that the animal carvings reflect hunting culture rather than any formal symbolic system. These are legitimate scientific debates, and they matter. But there is a version of this story that gets far less attention in academic papers than it deserves. The version where Göbekli Tepe is not an exception to the rule, but evidence that the rule was always wrong, because Göbekli Tepe is not alone. In the years since Schmidt's excavations gained international attention, similar sites have been identified across the broader region. Karahan Tepe, located about 35 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, contains pillars with even more elaborate human features, including one that appears to depict a full human figure emerging from the stone itself, rendered with anatomical detail that has no parallel in anything we previously believed existed at this point in history. Taş Tepeler, a Turkish archaeological initiative launched in 2021, has identified at least a dozen sites in the same region, all showing evidence of monumental construction, symbolic art, and coordinated labor during the same general period. This is not one anomaly anymore. This is a pattern. And patterns don't emerge from accidents. They emerge from cultures, from knowledge systems, from people who understood something about the world and about themselves that we are only now beginning to recover. And the stones are not silent. We just stopped knowing how to listen. There is a question that Sirius researchers have begun asking, quietly, carefully, in the language of peer-reviewed caution, that the public version of this story almost never reaches. If Göbekli Tepe existed 12,000 years ago, and if the dozen sites now identified around it suggest a regional culture of symbolic thought and monumental construction, then what came before it? Because Göbekli Tepe doesn't look like a beginning. It looks like a peak. The precision of the carvings, the scale of the pillars, the apparent astronomical alignments, the deliberate burial, none of these are the characteristics of a culture taking its first steps. They are the characteristics of a culture that had been doing something for a very long time, which means the starting point, the actual origin of whatever produced Göbekli Tepe, is still out there, unexcavated, possibly underwater, given that sea levels 12,000 years ago were significantly lower than they are today, and vast stretches of coastline that were once inhabited are now beneath the ocean floor. We may never find it, but the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Klaus Schmidt died in 2014, still excavating. He never saw the ground-penetrating radar results that confirmed the scale of what remained buried. He never saw Karahan Tepe or the Taş Tepeler initiative. He spent 20 years of his life on a hillside in southeastern Turkey, pulling stones out of the earth one by one, knowing that the implications of what he was finding would take generations to fully absorb. In one of his last recorded statements, he said something that has stayed with researchers ever since. He said that Göbekli Tepe proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the need to build, the need to create something larger than yourself, something that would outlast you, was not a product of civilization. It was the cause of it. 12,000 years ago, on a limestone ridge above a fertile valley, a group of people who had never read a history book, because history books didn't exist yet, decided that something was worth building. They quarried the stone, they shaped it, they raised it, and then, when the time came, they buried it carefully, as if they knew that one day, someone would need to find it. We found it. The question now is whether we're ready to understand what it means.